So as already been introduced, my name's Dr. Susan Bennett and I'm a scientific officer with the Forensic Services Group with the New South Wales Police Force. So I'm not a police officer, I'm what we call a civilian or an unsworn, but I do work with our crime scene personnel who are all primarily police officers. And as already mentioned, I was one of the first graduates of the University of Technology Sydney Forensic Science degree, as also Claude was quite subtly mentioned on Monday. You're probably not aware, but as a part of that degree, it's a 4-year program, and in the 4th year it includes a 6-month research project to go towards the honours component, and that's actually how I became involved in the case that I'm going to present today. I basically did all the interpretation studies and the research that was used in this case for my honours project. So I pretty much got a head start on all the other students in my year, that basically my research was directly used in a case. It was essentially my first case. So just to continue your geography lesson on the country of Australia, the largest island in the world, which is how I like to refer to it because it's a bit more positive than the smallest continent. Basically, this is the location of New South Wales. It's not the largest state in Australia, but it does have the largest population. And this case, where we're based is Sydney is the capital of New South Wales, which is where this case occurred. There's a lovely shot of our Opera House. So please don't take this case study as a negative or anything. It's probably not the best promotion for a visit to Sydney, but you definitely should come and visit. And so just a brief overview, the New South Wales Police Force. We have gone through a number of name changes over the last couple of years. At the moment we're a police force. It is the largest and the oldest in Australia and actually has its origins in the First Fleet, which is the first shipment of convicts out to establish the country of Australia. Forensic Services Group is one of the commands under the New South Wales Police Force, and it is now split into 4 branches. The Crime Scene Services branch is responsible for all the crime scene response to the whole state, and that includes both what we separated out into the physical evidence response, which is what we call the trace evidence and DNA recovery, and also the fingerprint crime scene response. So in New South Wales, it's a very separate thing, and I've never been able to quite figure out why. We then have the Identification Specialist branch, which is the ones they then process all the fingerprints that have been recovered from crime scenes. They also do fingerprint identifications for things such as visa applications and security clearances and things like that. The brand new Forensic Science Services branch, which is what was just established last July. And we have a newly renovated lab out in the western suburbs of Sydney, and I basically got to spend $2 million and buy absolutely every piece of equipment and instrument that I had ever wanted. So every now and then you do have a wish list of equipment, and every now and then it does happen that you do get it. And we did get it all at once, which I wouldn't really recommend. It's quite difficult to coordinate the installation of all this stuff all at the same time. So this case I'm about to present was a New South Wales Police case. The actual fibre comparison was done by the Physical Evidence Lab at the Division of Analytical Laboratories in Sydney, which is a separate lab under our health system. It was referred to Dr. James Robertson of the Australian Federal Police to comment on the significance of the fibre evidence in this case. And then I was involved because I was a student at the University of Technology in Sydney. So there was quite a lot of collaboration, a lot of agencies involved just in the fibre evidence for this particular case. And here we go. So it's actually a murder, and the body of a young woman was discovered down the side of the road in one of the suburbs on the northern side of Sydney on the 2nd of April 1995. She was wearing white or light beige jeans, a dark blue cotton t-shirt, blue denim jacket, and she was wearing light beige fashion hiking boot, would probably be the best way to describe it. And there's another crime scene photo. If you would like to have a closer look at some more crime scene photos, I actually have brought them on CD if you want to have a closer look at those. But basically she was identified as a young woman who had gone missing 3 days earlier. It is believed she had been strangled, although that was very difficult for the pathologist to prove at court, and there was actually quite a lot of debate over her time of death, which became significant and was one of the other interesting features of this case. But primarily what we're interested in is, at the scene, the crime scene officer noticed that on the soles of the victim's shoes were a large number of fibres. So he did what we request our crime scene officers to do. He collected all the loose fibres at the scene so that they weren't lost. And there were quite a number of fibres that were very strongly adhering to the boot, so he left those in place and removed the whole item and took them back to his crime scene section to photograph them. So every now and then they do listen to us and do a good job. And actually, as an aside, he was actually quite harshly criticised at court for doing that, even though that is exactly what we request him to do. So these are the soles of the victim's shoes that he's photographed. You probably can't really see where the fibres are located on these because they're pretty small, but you'll see there are striations on the shoe soles, which is another interesting feature of this case that we can talk about later if people would want to come and find me. But basically, on each sole of the shoe, on her right sole, they found 5 grey polypropylene fibres, 5 blue polypropylene fibres, and 26 black polyester. And then on the left shoe, there were 4 grey, 7 blue, and 24 black. So there was a total of 71 fibres on the soles of the shoes of the victim. So that quite strongly suggests that the source of these fibres are most likely a carpet. And from this, not usually a good idea, but the percentage composition of those would be 13% grey, 17% blue polypropylene, and about 70% black polyester. So these are some closer photographs of how some of the fibres are adhering. So you can see why the crime scene investigator could notice these. They're quite large, they're quite long and dark, and it's probably a bit difficult to see, but they're quite heavily matted against the surface of the shoe, and in some places they line up with those striations that you could see in the larger shoe sole photos. So primarily, the most likely source of these fibres were a carpet. So the detectives and the crime scene investigators went out and collected comparison samples from the victim's home, the vehicle of the victim and her family and friends, carpets of all the classrooms that she attended at the university she was a student of, the carpet of the bus that she caught to uni. Pretty sickly, they went through every step that she had taken for the previous couple of days, and anywhere there was a carpet, they took a sample. And then the lab that did the fibre comparison compared all of those, and they were all eliminated as possible sources. Now, while this was going on, the detectives were doing their job, which is also sometimes quite unusual. We were out interviewing suspects, and they had identified a potential suspect was an ex-boyfriend of the victim. And he initially, when he was questioned and gave a statement, said that they had a relationship for a while but had broken up earlier in the year, and he had not had any contact with her for 6 weeks. But the interesting thing was that the victim's ex-boyfriend owned a 1991 model Honda CRX, which I'm not sure if it's a similar cars were available here, but it's a small sporty Honda that was quite reasonably popular at the time. So they obtained a carpet sample from this particular Honda CRX and found that it was composed of what the manufacturer called off-black, or grey, we were calling grey polypropylene, blue polypropylene and black polyester, and basically the fibre examination done at the DAL could not differentiate the two samples. And there's some pretty good micrographs that does strongly suggest that they are from the same source, I know. So again, the detectives went off and did their questioning. They found that from the manufacturer, that was the composition, and this particular carpet had only been used in the 1990 and 91 model Honda CRX. 296 of those had been sold in Australia. They then tracked down 291 of those owners through the various motoring organisations and sales groups throughout the country. So there was only 5 vehicles that they were not able to account for. They got affidavits from every single owner of those 291 owners, and they were all submitted to court. And basically, of those 5 vehicles, this vehicle that was this guy's car was one of those 5, so there were 4 out there somewhere that could never be tracked. So in his first statement, the suspect had said he had not had any contact with the victim for 6 weeks. After he had been told about this, though, of course, his story changed, which is then when the detective decided probably, well, this is our guy, we're going to focus on him, because as soon as the suspect changes their story, the detectives get very excited. And in his second statement, he said, no, actually, I did meet her 2 weeks earlier. We caught up to exchange. I had some things of hers and she's had some of mine, and we got together and exchanged and returned items. So at this point, the detective had decided this guy had done it. But for the fibre comparison to be able to assess how significant that wasn't really good enough. So my research was then to look at all the factors that influence the transfer and persistence of the particular fibres and include the carpet of this car as a part of that study. So the first one was to look at the fibre transfer of carpet fibres to shoe soles. And this involved the use of 4 different types of shoes, one of which was the type of sole used in the manufacture of the shoes that the victim was wearing, and looking at how, if there was any correlation between the depth of the tread of the shoe sole and how many fibres transferred. I did this in 5 different cars, one of which was the car actually in this case, so I got to sit in it for a very long time. And the type of transfer was basically I sat in each car for 5 minutes and just sort of shuffled my feet around, not too energetically, and also 30 minutes, and for each of those did that for each type of car, for each type of shoe sole, and 3 replicates for each. So I read a lot of books while I did this project. But basically, this is a graph of the fibres that were transferred from the actual car in this case. All the rest are actually in a paper that's referenced in the paper for this presentation in your CD if you want to look it up. But basically, with just normal movement for about 30 minutes, you're looking at just over 30 fibres on average transferred to both shoes for this particular type of shoe. And in this case, the total was 71. Now, we also did a few other little interesting look at the effect of a few different things on fibre transfer, which at the time in the paper probably looked a bit strange as to why you would even worry about this. But we looked at whether if their car mats were present would reduce the number of fibres transferred, and of course they did, because they're covering quite a large section of the carpet. And we also found that violent braking did not cause us to transfer as many fibres as normal movement as someone sitting in the car. So it wasn't the pressure that was applied, it's the movement back and forth that was transferring the fibres. The reason we did these studies as well is that the defence had a bit of money and got their own expert who wrote a big, huge report, and basically was of the opinion that when the victim and the suspect met 2 weeks earlier, she was in his vehicle, he had to brake violently for a red light or whatever the reason was, and in that violent braking, these fibres from the carpet could have fused to her shoe soles and may have been present there for weeks, months, or even years. And then the reason the car mats came into his scenario, so 2 weeks before, he didn't have car mats present. He then bought them a week or so later. At the time of her disappearance, there were car mats in the car, so it couldn't have been transferred then. It must have been the 2 weeks earlier when she was sitting in his car with him. Now, common sense would tell you, yeah, that's not very likely. We don't see fibres on our shoe soles all the time. And actually, when you mention the case to people, particularly presenting it to crime scene examiners, as soon as you say that part, they instantly start looking at their shoe soles to see if there's anything there. But the interesting thing was that basically the defence expert and the defence didn't challenge the source of the fibres. They didn't give the usual argument, well, fibres are incredibly common, they're mass produced, this doesn't mean anything. They didn't contest that the fibres had come from this vehicle. What they argued was how long they had persisted. So that's what became the significant consideration in the interpretation of this case. So a large part of the studies I did were just to demonstrate how very little space of time fibres persist on shoe soles. So the 4 different types of shoes I used in the study, tried to transfer as many fibres as I could to them, and basically took them off and rubbed them on the carpet quite vigorously and covered them with fibres, and then went walking around. I did this part at the Australian Federal Police lab in Canberra, so they all thought I was quite strange, just traipsing around the place doing... No one actually knew what I was doing, they just thought, there's that strange girl walking around again. We walked over different surfaces, so looked at vinyl, carpet, concrete and grass, so that's like where there's grass and there's a concrete footpath, and also what we call bitumen or asphalt, the type of surface used in roadways. But we're mainly interested in what would happen as you walked over grass, because of the location where she had been found. For her to walk there, would have had to walk over grass. Basically found no matter how many fibres you transferred to the shoe soles, no fibres remained after walking over concrete and grass for 5 minutes. Walking over vinyl and bitumen, sometimes there were a few fibres that persisted, but they were always in the recessed area of the sole, or they had physically cut into the rubber of the sole and were physically trapped. And they were always very small, like 3 or 4 fibres at most. So we also looked, and this part of the study was done by the analyst at DAL. He basically took samples from 175 vehicles, and 29 of those were Honda manufactured vehicles. There was only one vehicle with a similar carpet, which was the 1991 Honda Civic. However, when he took that sample and actually analysed it, all 3 fibres in that carpet were polypropylene. There was no black polyester, and found that most cars had only 1 fibre type or 2, and only 12% had 3 types, and 2.8% had 4 or more. So the database of automotive carpets that was a poster yesterday would have been incredibly useful in this case. And they also had, as part of the frequency studies, they called an expert from the automotive industry in Australia and basically testified that polyester is not used in car carpets in Australia. In fact, it's not really used in carpets at all. So that this carpet not only had 3 different fibre types present, but also included polyester, was very uncommon. So Dr. James Robertson was the expert who went to court to testify in this case. He presented all this work as well as his years of experience, and basically summed up his conclusion was, and I'll read it so I don't get it wrong because I'll get in trouble. What I am able to conclude on the basis of the substantial experimental data available to me is that the victim did not walk for any substantial time after contact with the source of the fibres found on her boots. By substantial time, I mean a matter of minutes and not hours or longer. And remember, the defence expert had said that they could have been there up to years. Given the number of fibres said to have been recovered from the boots, it is probable that the time or distance walked would have been less than that covered in 5 minutes. So essentially, she didn't walk after these fibres had been transferred. So this case first went to trial in 1998. And this is now another interesting aspect of the case is the whole legal argument around it. And the accused was found guilty. The defence appealed this decision, as they often do, on the basis that at the trial, the prosecution actually argued 2 alternatives. They actually, once you kind of decipher all the legal jargon, that the defence had argued that either the suspect did murder the victim himself or he arranged for somebody else to murder her. So because they were actually arguing 2 different things, the appeal was upheld and the new trial writ was ordered. So it went to trial a second time, where this time they decided to argue that the suspect did kill the victim. And again, the accused was found guilty and was given a slightly longer sentence. And there was no consideration given for time already served. That decision was appealed again by the defence, but was not successful. And they appealed then again to the High Court of Australia, which is the highest avenue of appeal in our country. So basically all avenues of appeal have been exhausted for this case. And at the moment, the earliest he's due for parole is May 2012. So it's not that long away now, actually. There you go.